For some people, a trip on a ferry is the longest sea journey they'll ever take. For many, it is an enjoyable experience, often a prelude to a vacation. But occasionally, things go wrong. The results can be catastrophic. Like other ships, ferries are subject to the inherent dangers of sea travel, like bad weather or navigation errors. But there are other reasons carefree ferry trips have ended in disaster. Thousands of lives have been lost when ferries sank because of gross overloading, fires, or collisions with other vessels. Disasters have also happened because of blunders in basic ferry design. For centuries, ferries have been used to transport people or goods. But it was not until well into the 20th century that operators realized money could be made by ferrying vehicles too. This led to the roll-on, roll-off ferry, with a large open vehicle deck and doors at the bow and stern. No one realized ferries designed like this were potentially dangerous. The first sign of a fatal design flaw came in January 1953, when the British ferry Princess Victoria capsized in a gale in the Irish Sea. Only 43 of 182 passengers and crew survived. A subsequent inquiry found that inadequate locks on the stern doors had burst open in the heavy seas. Water poured into the vehicle deck, completely destabilizing the vessel. At the time, it appeared to be a terrible accident. But pressures to increase business resulted in even larger roll-on, which increased their potential instability. Many of these ferries work the North Sea and the English Channel, two of the busiest and most dangerous waterways in the world. Collision was a greater risk than bad weather on these routes. In December 1982, a British ferry, the European Gateway, was damaged when it collided with the freighter Speedlink Vanguard. Seawater flooded the vehicle deck and it capsized. 6 people died. Many of the passengers were long-distance truck drivers. As they boarded, none of them understood the danger. Even after the disaster, the possibility of an underlying problem was still not realized. Nevertheless, the speed with which the European Gateway listed and went over astonished everyone. One survivor described it.
Within 2-3 minutes, the boat was listing to, I would say, 45 degrees.
And you were, where were you?
On the starboard side of the boat.
Actually on the boat as it went over?
Yeah.
The fact that the disaster had been caused by a collision masked the inherent dangers in the roll-on, roll-off ferry design. By the mid-1980s, commercial ferry traffic between the UK and Europe had increased dramatically. Plus, 20 million people a year cross the English Channel alone, many of them on shopping trips to France. But on the evening of March 6, 1987, Britain suffered its worst peacetime maritime disaster since the Titanic went down in 1912. It was caused by a blunder that would have devastating and far-reaching consequences. "500 passengers boarded the British ferry Herald of Free Enterprise in March 1987. They were returning to Dover, England, from a day trip in the Belgian port of Zeebrugge. But only a mile from Dover Harbor, disaster struck. It was common for the ferry's bow doors to remain open to help clear fumes from the vehicle deck. Within a few minutes, thousands of gallons of seawater poured in. The passengers above were unaware of the situation that was about to endanger them. As the Herald of Free Enterprise began turning starboard, the water on the vehicle deck flowed to port. More water now flooded through the open bow doors. The ferry began listing, then heeled over, turned 180 degrees, and came to rest on its side, facing the harbor entrance. Help arrived almost immediately, but it was already too late for 193 passengers and crew. As dawn broke the next day, the scale of the disaster became more apparent. Nothing could have been more obvious than the gaping hole in the ferry's bow. The subsequent inquiry was presided over by Justice Sheen, a wartime naval officer and respected maritime lawyer. He was supported by various shipping experts. Their task was to determine the cause of the accident and to recommend a remedy so that such a thing could never happen again. Attention inevitably focused on the bow door. A reconstruction video showed that water could breach the ferry door at only 16.9 knots. The Herald of Free Enterprise's bow had also been weighted with ballast. This lowered it 3 feet and made it easier to load in Zeebrugge Harbor. Tank testing and demonstrations also provided conclusive proof that if the bow doors were left open, water would flood in. The water would then cross the open deck as the ferry moved, its enormous weight fatally destabilizing the doomed craft and causing it to capsize almost immediately. It was known as the free water effect. The scale of the inquiry was exhaustive. Attorney David Steele, acting for the British Ministry of Transport, had scathing criticism for the ferry company, Townsend Torreson. No one at its senior management level was responsible for the overall safety of the fleet. Of leaving the bow doors open as the ferry left port. Richard Stott, coroner at the inquest, suggested that specific members of the crew might have been negligent in not closing the doors before the ferry sailed. But it was clear they were only following established practice. The British jury returned with a verdict of unlawful killing. Not everyone was pleased.
I'm disappointed because the unlawful killing verdict by the coroner's ruling has been restricted to individuals, and individuals near the bottom of the chain of command, where many of us believed and hold that the inquest should have been opened up to take in the conduct of the company.
As a result of the Herald of Free Enterprise disaster, roll-on, roll-off ferry operators were given strict new guidelines for the future. Closed-circuit television was introduced. The captain was to be immediately informed of any problems. Most important, it was recommended that a ferry should never leave port unless its bow doors were firmly closed. This fact had to be relayed to the bridge by a specific officer. Everyone was determined that such an appalling tragedy would never happen again. In fact, it shouldn't have happened in the first place. Tests showed that incorporating large side wedges into the design of the ferry could keep it afloat no matter how much water it took on. Individual acts of heroism on the Herald of Free Enterprise Britain's highest award for civilian bravery. He had formed a human bridge to help others escape.
Well, I am very proud, but my pride is tinged with the sadness created by the death of so many people a year ago.
The Herald of Free Enterprise was eventually towed to India and dismantled. But before long, an even worse ferry disaster would occur. On September 27, 1994, the ferry Estonia capsized and sank in less than 20 minutes. 852 people died, making it Western Europe's worst passenger ship disaster in peacetime. The Estonia was making her regular voyage across the Baltic Sea from Tallinn in Estonia to Stockholm, Sweden. Despite bad weather, passengers soon settled down in onboard bars and restaurants, or went straight to their cabins. The giant ferry made her way at 14 knots into the open sea. She passed two other vessels which had slowed down because of heavy seas. A crew member went to check on the vehicle deck. On his way to the bow, he heard a strange banging and scraping sound. He immediately reported this to the bridge. At 1:15 a.m., the engine room alerted the bridge. Water was streaming from the vehicle deck into the area below the lowest cabins. At that moment, the Estonia listed violently, throwing passengers from their beds. Some of them were 6 levels below the lifeboat deck. The ship settled on her side in the icy water. Panic-stricken passengers tried to escape through vertical corridors and stairways. This proved too much for many of them. They fell back to their deaths. Those who managed to make it found that only half the lifeboats had been launched. The ship was listing too steeply for the others to be released. Daylight made the search easier, but now it was obvious there had been a huge loss of life. The the Estonia, 20 miles south of the coast of Finland. Estonia's massive bow visor was found a mile from where she had gone down. A subsequent Swedish inquiry found the faulty and poorly maintained locking mechanism had failed. The visor had been torn off in the heavy seas. The Estonia still remains on the seabed, lying in water shallow enough to be reached by divers. But it was considered too difficult to raise her and too dangerous for the bodies to be recovered. She has become a tomb, yet another tragic victim of the free water effect. Ferry disasters have also been caused by human blunders. In April 1990, 158 people died when the Danish-registered Scandinavian Star caught fire. It was crossing from Norway to Denmark. The fire spread so quickly, officers on the bridge did not know which part of the ship was affected. They closed fire doors, inadvertently trapping many of the victims. It was only the skill of rescue services and other nearby vessels that saved anyone at all. A subsequent inquiry discovered the Scandinavian Star also caught fire 2 years before in the Gulf of Mexico. It was then transferred to Scandinavian waters, but apparently it was not fully inspected before resuming operations. If such an inspection had been conducted, many of the ferry's inadequacies, human and otherwise, would no doubt have been discovered. Ferry operators in the West have learned from these incidents, unlike the world's poorer countries where major tragedies are all too commonplace. In 1993, the Neptune sank off the west coast of Haiti, killing more than 1,000 people. Unofficial estimates put the number on board closer to 2,000, but it was only licensed to carry 250. Many of the survivors clung to floating animal carcasses or bags of charcoal for up to 31 hours before being washed ashore. There were angry demands for the ferry owners to be punished. 4 years later, in September 1997, there was another ferry disaster in Haiti. The La Fierté Gonavienne sank just 50 yards from shore. 200 people lost their lives, most of them trapped on the lower decks. The ferry was grossly overloaded and crowded. There was no life-saving equipment aboard. The world's worst ferry disaster took place on December 20th, 1987 in the Philippines. The Doña Paz sank in the Tablas Strait en route from Tacloban to Manila. It collided with an oil tanker. The loss of life was horrendous. Approximately 4,200 people either drowned or died in the terrible fire which engulfed the ship after the collision. 1,000 were children. The Doña Paz had been terribly overcrowded. It carried almost 3 times its limit of 1,800 passengers. Many of the survivors suffered extensive burns. Relatives scoured lists of the dead and missing posted at the ferry operators' offices. In grief and desperation, their anger reached a boiling point. In contrast, safety now takes priority over everything else in Western ferry operations. No ferry run by a Western company goes to sea with its bow doors open. Regular and scrupulous maintenance is now the standard, as are securely locked and reinforced bow doors, watertight bulkheads when possible, fire alarms and sprinklers, easily released lifeboats and life jackets, and a crew that is competent in the case of an emergency. Western ferry operators are determined not to repeat the blunders of the past. Elsewhere, however, not much has changed. Passengers will continue to die when operators put profit before safety.